story took place in a small town located in western China. This town was isolated, so it had not developed much until now. The following story was all about my grandfather's experiences. My grandfather was a very famous person in town. When my grandfather was young, he was a skilled carpenter. He was often invited to other people's homes to build furniture. But later, my grandfather changed his profession to making coffins. The reason for changing jobs was that since my grandfather was injured and had a scary scar on his face, people stopped hiring him to build things in the house. Only the profession of making coffins was that customers didn't care what the builder looked like. All coffins made by grandfather were made according to the traditional process. The coffins would be made of white stubble and painted with a final coat of primer when the coffins were sold. Every time my grandfather finished making a coffin, he would put the thin layer of quicktime on the bottom of it. Grandpa said quicktime would resist mold and insects, but this lime layer couldn't come into contact with the deceased. Grandpa would add another layer of wood on top of the lime. I thought only skilled craftsmen worked so meticulously. All these factors had made grandfather's coffin products highly appreciated by locals. There hadn't been a second coffin shop locally for many years now. But coffins were rarely sold because the demand for coffins depended on the number of deaths in a year. In most of his free time, Grandpa used to sit on the recliner in front of the shop. When I was little, I didn't understand what my grandfather used to sit there for. I always wondered what he was thinking. All I knew was that Grandpa lived these days like that for decades. Then, one morning a few years ago, a villager came to lay the coffin at my grandfather's place. And from that moment on, strange things kept happening after that coffin contained dead bodies. At that time, my father went to the city. My grandfather was looking for a young man. He would drive a delivery truck in town to deliver goods on behalf of my father. At that time, my father was in his 20s, and he was also a handsome young man. But because of selling coffins for my grandfather, no girl dared to love my father. So he got angry and left the city. In the past, the goods used to be all delivered by the grandfather himself. During these years, he was indeed old and no longer strong enough. That morning, after handing over the coffin to the delivery young man, my grandfather repeatedly instructed him to remind him what to tell the deceased's family about the traditional custom. There were still a few families who could fully implement these rules, but my grandfather requested his rules must be clear, and they need to do it themselves. After a busy morning with work, Grandpa leisurely walked the street. Grandpa had lived in this small town all of his life and had never been out of town. He was familiar with every brick in his town. He said that he lived a very comfortable life here. The people in town also respected him very much. That day, on the walk, Grandpa greeted a few people he knew, and at the same time looked for a breakfast restaurant to have breakfast. But at this moment, he suddenly saw a group of people passing by carrying a coffin. Only then did Grandpa know that the coffin was the one that was made by him and delivered this morning. In terms of time, the family was currently carrying the coffin, proving that all formalities for worship had not been carried out before. Grandpa didn't know if the shipper who delivered the coffin told that family about the procedure, so he felt a little uncomfortable. But it was probably too late to say anything more now because the coffin had already been carried, so my grandfather could only grumble a few words with the owner of the breakfast shop. On the way back to the shop, Grandpa happened to be on the same road as the coffin-carrying procession. Grandpa walked slowly behind. At first, he guessed that the family did not appear to be properly prepared for the funeral. Paper money was just a few change bills. Faced with these, my grandpa didn't know what to say. However, at that moment, a strange thing happened. When the procession carrying the coffin came to a stone bridge, suddenly the 4 people carrying the coffin stopped. As soon as the 4 stopped, the whole funeral was forced to stop. The 2 leaders of the delegation also looked back when they discovered the situation. The 4 people carrying the coffin suddenly changed color. The whole body trembled, and both hands firmly grasped the coffin. After seeing the appearance of the four people, my grandpa could guess that the inside of the coffin was becoming heavier and heavier. One of them had to exclaim why the coffin was so heavy. This thing was strange, because these muscular men could lift an object weighing more than 400 kilograms together. Meanwhile, the coffin plus the dead person inside did not exceed 200 kilograms. At this time, the coffin seemed to be getting heavier and heavier, causing the rope to lift the coffin to be pulled very straight and make a creaking sound when it came into contact with the coffin. The legs of the four of them were constantly shaking, becoming more and more curved. It looked like the coffin was about to fall to the ground. Everyone present saw it, and they were a little stunned with fear, not knowing what to do.
"How is that possible?"
one exclaims. My grandpa just walked in from behind the crowd. After seeing that the coffin was about to fall to the ground, my grandfather was extremely frightened and immediately shouted to the front. Hearing my grandfather's shouts, the men lifted the coffin a little, but they couldn't stand it for long. At this time, my grandfather guessed there was something evil in the coffin, so he immediately went to that family and asked how the person in it died. When they first bought the coffin, they told my grandpa that the person died of illness. However, at this point it was no longer possible to hide it, so a man in that family told the truth. It turned out that this family was my grandpa's acquaintance in town. They also knew each other. The person lying in the coffin was the daughter-in-law of this family, and the fault was that of her husband. The husband was the son of this family. He worked in the city all year round. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law stayed at home to take care of the elderly and the children. One evening 3 days ago, the husband suddenly came home from the city. But when he got home, he sat down at the table, bowed his head, and said nothing. At first, the wife thought her husband was tired of driving, so she did not ask much. She wanted to cook some dishes for her husband. But at this moment, her husband suddenly said something. The husband did not bring any good news, but wanted a divorce. "I'm back for a divorce. I have another woman, and we have a child together in the city," the husband asserted. With the story of the husband dating other women in the city, the wife had guessed for a long time. However, she was still afraid that unreasonable questions of jealousy would affect their relationship if it was not true. But she did not expect the husband to be so heartless. He returned after many months and bluntly wanted to divorce her because of another woman. After hearing his words, the wife was speechless all night. Then, after a while of silence, no one spoke. They decided to go to sleep. The two lay with their backs to each other all night. The husband felt ashamed. He wanted to open his mouth to talk to his wife many times, but in the end he still didn't know what to say. He knew that his wife had not slept and cried all night. He was the one to blame. Unexpectedly, that night, a terrible thing happened that no one could have foreseen. After a restless night, the husband fell asleep without realizing it. When it was just dawn, he woke up and was surprised to find that his wife was still asleep. This made him realize something was wrong because his wife usually got up early to clean the house. Lying for a long time, he still did not hear his wife speak. When he turned around and saw his wife lying across from him, the husband suddenly trembled with fear. He must have seen something terrible. It turned out that his wife had taken poison to commit suicide last night. Her face was blue and purple because she was poisoned. Her nose was bleeding. The story happened so suddenly the husband also knew he had no face to tell the truth, so he lied that his wife died from a stroke. Grandfather heard the story with a sigh because the family didn't tell the story of the other daughter-in-law to him. This position was a bridge. The water under the bridge was cloudy, making it easier to aggravate this injustice. The only thing the husband could do now was to try to ask for forgiveness of the woman's soul. Failure to do so would result in the coffin falling, the woman's spirit being unable to leave, and the family unstable. The man didn't know if it was his conscience speaking or not, or if he was afraid of the death of his wife. He immediately ran to the coffin and bowed his head to ask forgiveness, but after a while, the coffin was still very heavy. Perhaps such bad things could not be easily forgiven. The man now had no choice but to kneel on the ground and try to beg for forgiveness. My grandpa couldn't count how many head bumps the husband did. Only afterwards, there was blood on his forehead. The coffin was suddenly lighter. Before, no one thought that inside the coffin was a woman who had to suffer such injustice to the point of committing suicide. Those present said that this woman was indeed a good wife, and she still felt pain when she died. Grandpa saw this and said a few more comforting words, then the coffin was back to normal. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. After the incident happened, the coffin-carrying group felt a little sorry. They carefully carried the coffin towards the cemetery. At this point, the matter had been resolved. Seeing the large crowd carrying the coffin to leave, the grandfather always felt a little moved towards that ill-fated wife. Grandpa always said that he didn't know what was going on in this world anymore. Every rule seemed to be treated as a trifle, and no one talked about it anymore. Everything in this world was possible. Death was always inevitable. However, in some cases dying was not the best way. Grandfather still sat on the chair in front of the shop and smoked every day, watching the time go by boredly. There were still many more stories about him. I would tell them slowly. It took place in 1983 in a small village north of Jiangzhou, China. Lu and his father, Mr. Yang, were worriedly walking around outside their house. Mr. Yang felt strange in his heart when he saw his son so nervous, so he constantly comforted him. "Mei is in good health. There will be no issue." However, Lu's nervousness was not unusual given that he and his wife Mei had been married for 7 years but had no children. The entire family, including the elderly father who had been waiting for their daughter-in-law Mei to become pregnant, and the time had finally come for her to give birth. And the midwife went into the room all morning and still didn't see anything, so the father tried to comfort his son, telling him to calm down and not to worry too much. Finally, near noon, there were children's cries from inside the house, which delighted Lu and the old father. Hearing the child's cry, everything seemed to become more beautiful and stronger, and the hearts of both the Chu's family, father and son, seemed to burst with joy as a result of happiness. After 10 minutes, the door opened and Sen, the midwife, stepped out. "Aunt Sen, is our child born?" Lu inquired cheerfully. They were speechless when they learned that Mei had given birth to their first fat son, and Lu was as happy as if he had caught gold. Miss Sen had been a midwife her entire life, and she knew that while Lu was not young, he was a first-time father, so she advised him not to be too hasty and to keep the child's mother from going out in the wind. Lu was so excited that he didn't listen to what Miss Sen said next and ran into the house to see his wife and children. With joy-like celebration, Miss Yang finally had a grandson. He prepared a large red envelope for Miss Sen. However, after a few sentences, the old lady Sen pushed open the red envelope and hurriedly left. "Remember to keep the windows closed at night when giving something for the baby and mom to nourish their bodies." As he watched her rush out of the house, Mr. Yang wondered in his heart, was there something wrong? However, the family and Lu, who were now surrounded by the newborn and May, quickly dismissed these minor concerns. Everyone was concerned about May's health because this was her first child, and everyone was overjoyed to see their first grandson. Lu used to lose his temper a lot because May couldn't have children, but now he appeared to be extremely happy with everyone, and he always had a smile on his face. The child had grown stronger and stronger with the help of every family member, and May's body had also recovered. But on the night the baby was born, the moon was very full and something strange happened. The couple was sleeping with their baby in their arms one night. Lu and May were fast asleep. May was startled awake by the baby's cry, which sounded very eerie and strange, and it was frightening. May initially assumed it was her son who had awoken in the middle of the night crying. She didn't know if the child was hungry or in pain. But when she opened her eyes, her son was soundly sleeping next to her. But the crying continued in waves and didn't stop. May considered getting up to listen more carefully, but her body appeared to be pressed by a heavy object, rendering her temporarily immobile. Immediately following that, May felt a small black shadow crawling over her. She was not sure if it was a dream or not. May couldn't move, but she could roll her eyes down and see a baby crawling on top of her. The child appeared to have been born recently, but the entire body was grey, with a few blue veins on the head, and it appeared very frightening. What was more terrifying was that the child had a mouth, and it was covered in layers of sharp little teeth. He was a child from hell. The child gradually climbed onto May's chest, eventually removing her shirt and biting her nipple. Her chest was painfully pierced by the small fangs the infant was sucking. May had now no idea how long the baby had been sucking milk violently like a demon, and she had gradually lost consciousness. May didn't wake up until the next morning. Everything that happened last night was dreadful. May still had a lingering fear from last night's horrifying scene. She thought it was a nightmare, but the dream was too real. Lu awoke some time ago, desperately clutching the child on the ground. What happened? It was strange because their son had been so healthy since birth. He had never cried before, and no one knew what made him cry so hard. Fearing that Lu was clumsy and didn't know how to care for the baby, May got out of bed and continued to care for his son. But the child kept crying, and he kept crying louder and louder, making May impatient and heartbroken for the little child. The child's grandmother was wise and knew that the baby would not cry for no reason, so she advised the couple to closely monitor the baby. However, when the tiny duvet was opened, even elderly people such as the baby's grandmother were taken aback. It was red and swollen on their son's fragile neck, with small holes in the same place. They appeared to have been bitten by small teeth. When May saw this wound, she immediately remembered a nightmare from the night before. She told her mother and Lu about her ordeal last night. After she finished speaking, she felt a slight pain in her chest. When she opened her shirt, she discovered a row of tiny teeth marks. Hadn't she had a dream last night? Didn't the child's grandmother immediately recognize the newborn ghost, as the old people in the countryside used to say? She stated that in rural areas, if a newborn dies, it cannot be buried or burned. Instead, most of them are found in the open field and discarded. It was claimed that these children had suffered too many injustices and that they must be exposed to the sun in an open area to be exonerated. However, some dead babies were born in clouds, moons, and stars, and because these places were rich in yin, they became a kind of newborn ghost, carrying heavy resentment. This type of newborn ghost harbored a deep resentment. They relied solely on nature to find milk everywhere, infecting young mothers who had recently given birth nearby. According to May, she was targeted by an infant ghost. At the time, she had just given birth. When she noticed that the couple was both scared, she quickly said something else so that they wouldn't be too concerned. They followed the child's grandmother to the deserted grasslands west of the village where children's bodies were frequently dumped. Surely a dead child was thrown nearby, she said, and that child had turned into a ghost infant, and we could tell them apart. Lou and his father spent the night in the grasslands, where they discovered a dead child lying alone on the moor. The features on the dead child's face were hideous and frightening, and his mouth was still stained with blood. The Yang family's father and son couldn't bear what it had done to their children and grandchildren, so they went out and found a lot of wood and placed it on the ghost child. Following that, a fire burned that horrifying ghost child, who appeared to be very frightening. The newborn ghost never appeared again. Lou's son stopped crying, but the baby's body was always a little weak and sick, which the grandmother attributed to the nun's mother's collision. Later, with the help of the midwife Sen, they learned how to better care for the child, and that dreadful story was never told again. Miss Sen also stated that she recently gave birth to a child for a family in a neighboring village, but the child died shortly after birth. Miss Sen recognized this as a bad omen, but no one believed this and did not expect the dead child to actually become a newborn ghost. This scary story happened in a fishing village in China a few years ago. There was a woman who had been waiting for someone under the lighthouse at the pier for 7 days. She was the wife of Fang, a fisherman. On the day Fang set sail, his boat was suddenly hit by a storm and had not returned for 7 days. Although her son advised her to return home, the wife still waited there. Fang's wife had been waiting on the pier for 7 days now. Each time she was dragged home by her son to stop waiting. This village was a typical fishing village of Fujian province, China. The people were all fishing on the sea, so sometimes shipwrecks were inevitable. Finally, the bad news came on the 8th day. The son then panicked and ran to the reporter to tell his mother that he had seen Fang's body washed up on the beach. The wife had already guessed the outcome, but in her heart she still hoped that her husband would return safely. Fang's body was soaked in water for a long time, so it looked terrible when it washed up on the beach. Fang's corpse was densely covered with sea creatures such as sea clams and conches. These often attached themselves to dead bodies in the sea. The people saw this and immediately helped clean Fang's body from sea clams and conch and brought his body home for burial. Those sea snails adhered to the skin of the decomposing corpse. When the people pulled the snail out with his hand, the snail would bring a piece of meat or skin from the corpse. The people made great efforts to help. People brought the body back to the village, prepared it for burial. Most people in shipwrecks died in such a tragic way. Sea clams and conch were removed from Fang's corpse still on the beach. After dark, a group of young people was walking by the beach. The sea was extremely cool but contained many dangers and death. These 3 young people all worked in town and turned back to the village at night to rest. That day they invited each other to go out to relieve stress. One of the groups, Han, found the sea clams and conches scattered on the beach. The group didn't know where the sea clams and conch came from, but these conches looked delicious. The rest of the group said, "These people are a waste. These delicious big conch are thrown here. This thing is a real bargain." So the whole group packed those snails and prepared them to bring home to cook and eat. The group did not forget to laugh happily because they accidentally caught delicious bait. The sky suddenly became pitch black, and clouds were gathering in the evening. The houses near the sea were quiet. The group went home to cook snails and make some small dishes, and then they started drinking. People lived near the sea that had one thing in common. They knew that the meat of this conch was very tender and juicy. This conch was large and had lots of meat. The young men pulled out the snail meat with a small toothpick. The snail was completely separated from the shell. The appearance was a little scary, but the meat was delicious. The conch was an expensive food in the city, therefore these young people couldn't ignore the immediate benefit. The group of young people used toothpicks to get the snail meat and ate happily. They looked like they were eating well. But only Han didn't eat any snails. "Why don't you eat it?" a young man asked Han. "I'm allergic to snails, so I can't try. You guys just eat it. I was scared when I looked at it," Han said. So the two remaining people gossiped and quickly ate all the conch. After eating, the group went to bed because it was past midnight. Because 3 young men were tired and had a little yeast in them, they slept soundly. Han also quickly fell asleep because he was too tired. Just sleeping for a while, Han was suddenly woken up by terrible screams. He still couldn't figure out where these screams were coming from because he was still sleepy. It turned out that one of his co-workers was sick. But isn't he sick? Han saw that person writhing in pain, his whole body arched, his whole body covered in a deadly gray. His stomach felt like something was moving. His belly was gradually bulging high, bulging like a pregnant woman. His belly was constantly expanding, the underbelly was twisting back and forth, looking very scary. Han was frightened by the sight and immediately went to his friend's bed to help him. At that time, there were also screams of pain from behind. Han wondered what had happened again. Han looked back. His other friend was also in great pain, to the point of kneeling on the bed. His whole body had blue veins, so painful that he gnashed his teeth as if he couldn't stand it anymore. Han did not dare to delay when he saw the situation. He immediately ran out to find a doctor. After a while, Han found a doctor who had been working in the village for more than 30 years. When the doctor arrived, Han's 2 friends passed out from the pain. The 2 of them looked like they were dead. Han looked at them with fear. The doctor said they had eaten something unclean. That was why it happened. Han told the doctor about these 2 eating the conches tonight. "We picked up some conch and mussels today. The 2 of them ate them," Han told the doctor. After listening, the doctor told Han about the terrible origin of those conches. Han's face paled from fear. The doctor said that conch and mussels were the things that contained the evilest spirits in the sea. They like to suck the yin gas of the dead. If we eat them a lot, they would be very harmful to our health. After that, the doctor went to get a bunch of sticky rice to soak in water. This way was a cure for conch poisoning. The doctor asked Han to give his water to his friends to drink so 2 friends could recover from their illness. After being poured a lot of sticky rice water into their mouths, the other 2 started vomiting madly. The scary thing was that the spit out conch meat was not completely digested, still intact with the shape of the conch. In ancient times, it was believed that conches and sea mussels could absorb yin and form pulls. Most sea snails and mussels were not very clean creatures at all. This story took place in Shengzhou, the capital of Henan province. After being unemployed for 4 months, I found a butcher position that was being hired at a vegetable market. Although this job was not a serious business, I had no choice with my savings. I walked into that butcher's shop and wanted to meet the butcher to interview for this position. As soon as I walked in, I could smell the strong smell of blood. The butcher shop owner was a healthy middle-aged man with a beard. I had always felt that all butchers had something that made me afraid of them. The boss was a very straightforward person. He told me about the salary and what I had to do and told me that this was also a hard job. If I was me before, I would never have chosen to work in such an environment. However, the current circumstances do not allow me to have more choices. The two of us then chatted a little more about the job's details after we finished the hiring process. I started working that very evening. Before that, I really couldn't imagine how this job would be. But when I started working, I found this job to be quite simple. My task was to cut the pork into small pieces. Then I would use the grinder to build the meat very finely. The fresh meat would be sold during the day. The remaining minced meat would be sold to the restaurant in the evening. So, this work could only be done at night. I never thought I would do such a boring and disgusting job. However, sometimes people had to bow to the reality of society. No matter how talented you were, as long as you couldn't pay the rent, you would still have to sleep on the street tomorrow. So even as the bloody smell of minced meat and nausea tormented me, I had to continue to suffer. The owner of the restaurant was Dai. He was a foreigner and lived in the back room of the butcher shop. Every night before he left, he always ordered 2 dishes and drinks from the small shop next door. I tried a lot in this job, but it seemed the owner was an alcoholic. He had little interest in my work. The thing that made me feel even more strange about the boss, every night when he was drunk, he would start cursing people, berating horribly, even a woman. After scolding all kinds of things, he fell asleep in shock. I had to drag him to the bed in the back room several times. I'd worked there for more than 10 days in a flash. One night the boss had to go out to meet people around a rather large restaurant. He did not forget to warn me to watch out for the store and pay attention to safety. I quickly replied that he should trust me completely. After 10 days of working, the boss gradually got close to me and became more comfortable with me. I also came to think differently about the boss. He was not a too bad person, except for his slightly aggressive temper and alcoholism. Since the boss wasn't home, I cut the meat a little bigger to save trouble. I felt like I already knew all of the capabilities of this high-powered meat grinder. But unexpectedly that day, because I did not remove all the bones in the meat, I caused the meat grinder to get stuck. Looking at the pile of pork waiting to be pureed, I began to think and suddenly remembered that there was also a meat slicer in the restaurant. I usually put it on the shelf in the corner of the store. I thought it would be reasonable backup equipment, so I took it out. This meat grinder was clean. I need to clean, wipe it, and then plug it in to grind the meat. But I didn't expect what was about to happen after. As soon as the cord was plugged into the electrical outlet, the light in the room blinked twice. At that time, I thought it was because the line of the meat slicer was not good. After a few blinks, the light bulb went back to normal, and I didn't care about it anymore. Afraid of getting stuck again, I checked the piece of meat just now, changed the knife and started grinding again. But at this time a strange thing happened. The meat grinder worked for a long time but did not produce meat. Instead, it spewed out a lot of black hair looking like human hair. I pulled those things out of the faucet when I took a closer look. It turned out to be a woman's long hair. Honestly, the long hair on a woman's head was normally pretty, but once the hair was cut and held in hand, it made people feel shivers. At that time, I was hit by a strong electrical current. My mind was dizzy for a moment and felt empty. At that time, my mind was like being in a movie. I saw a naked woman lying on a cutting board. Beside her, a strong man was standing with a knife. What followed was an extremely bloody scene. That man was cutting the woman's body into countless pieces with a knife. Then the woman's meat was pressed into a meat grinder and it became a fine puree. This scene made me nauseous. When all the body pieces were disposed of, only the head of the long-haired woman remained. But that woman's head couldn't fit into the meat grinder, and long hairs got tangled in the grinder's gears. Although it was a long story, the images of that story flashed through my mind very fast, and I woke up immediately. But when I looked down, I suddenly saw a human head on a meat grinder. I screamed in fear, and my legs could no longer stand. I sat down on the ground. I was shocked at the horrible scene before my eyes. Everything happened so fast that I didn't have time to figure it out. Suddenly, a large hand was put on my shoulder from behind. I was so scared that I screamed and turned my head suddenly to see who it was. It turned out that was the boss. He came back after finishing collecting the bill. Seeing me sitting on the ground, he asked me what I was doing, why I was sitting on the ground like that. I got up and told the boss that his backup meat grinder appeared to be leaking electricity and I appeared to have been electrocuted. I was trying to talk to my boss about what I just had seen before. I turned around and found everything was normal in the meat grinder. The scenes just now seemed to be just my hallucinations. The boss glanced at the meat grinder on the desk and was suddenly very angry. I didn't know why this trifle made him so angry. He fired me because I disobeyed. Strangely, he not only paid my salary in full, but also gave me 500 won more. I didn't want to learn more about this after I had left the butcher shop, but I thought there must be some horrible secret there. It occurred in Tai Po Town, Hong Kong in 2013. I wouldn't say exactly which hospital and which district it was in, because I was still working there. It was my second year working in this hospital and I had grown accustomed to the job, so my working attitude became sluggish. I was hiding in the corner of the stairs one afternoon to smoke a cigarette when I heard a nurse call my name.
Dr. Jin, I have a patient who requires surgery.
It turned out that a patient had just been taken to the emergency room with an injury that required immediate surgery. At the time, I wasn't the primary surgeon, but I was also a doctor. I didn't dare to ignore it at that time, so I immediately threw the cigarette butt away and dashed into the operating room with the nurse. I was a step behind schedule, and the patient was ushered into the emergency operating room. The treating doctor didn't even reprimand me, he simply told me to disinfect and get to work. I packed my belongings and rushed to the surgery room, and it was only then that I noticed the patient's wound. The patient had a severe wound, with the lower half of the arm completely gone. Despite my limited experience, I could see that the wound wasn't cut, that the arm had been completely ripped off by some force. This type of injury was uncommon, and it was also the most difficult type of hand surgery in which I had been directly involved. The surgery took more than 5 hours to complete, and we did our best to treat all of the nerves and blood vessels in the patient's wounded arm. When I arrived at work the next day, the patient had awakened and I had learned about his condition during the sessions. "How did you get injured like this?" I inquired. To be honest, I didn't care how his injury occurred. When he came to recall the reason, he had a terrifying expression on his face, as if he was hesitant to tell. His family lived in a rural suburb, a small fishing village by the sea, he said. While many people in the village relied on fishing for a living, his family was an exception. They relied on farming to support their family. Because there was a lot of arable land in the village, he told everyone in his family to clean up to start planting, and his family agreed. So, during this time he plowed the land, digging for many years without planting anything, and he was extremely tired, but he felt happy. He was digging in the ground the other day when he came to a halt with a stunned expression. He turned over his pickaxe and saw that it was a human skull, and half of it was rotting. Although this was not a good omen, he didn't take it too seriously because his ancestors had lived here for many generations, so the ground had buried a few dead people. Furthermore, those bones had been here for more than a dozen years. The ghost had long since reincarnated, and he threw all the bones he dug out on the grass at the field's edge. After a while, many more bone fragments were dug out one by one, but they were all broken up. When he finished digging, there was already a pile of bones lying there, and it appeared to be quite complete. He didn't think it was good to be seen by others, so he returned home after burying the bones. He lived in the westernmost part of the village, away from other people's homes. All other families' children worked in the city, and he was the only one who lived here alone. He was tired all day, so he went to bed early and fell asleep without noticing. He was awakened unexpectedly in the middle of the night by a knock on the door. The sound was becoming increasingly louder as if someone outside was knocking on the door. Whoever came to the door at this hour astounded him. Just as he was about to get up, the door of the room was violently opened. At the door, a shadow appeared. He inquired several times, but the shadow did not respond, and instead entered the room very naturally, as if it were a place devoid of people. As it got closer, he realized it was an old man dressed in antique clothing who looked very scary. But the old man only had one arm and shouted at him as he approached. The old man asked him to give back his arm because he had lost one, but this was a ridiculous request. The old man reacted hastily. Maybe today the skeleton he discovered in the ground had come to haunt him. Perhaps he lost a portion of the old man's arm while digging up bones. However, his bones were also discovered in a state of disarray. The old man walked over to the bed and grabbed his arm before he could react. He was not sure how skinny old man could be so strong. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his arm, and the elderly man with extraordinary strength yanked his arm away. The old man ripped his arm off and caused him great pain. The intense pain and fear caused his mind to go blank, and he couldn't feel anything. Then he passed out. When neighbors heard the screams, they discovered that he was injured badly and took him to the hospital. He had no idea where the ghost had taken his arm. The neighbors searched for a long time but were unable to locate it. After hearing what he said, I was speechless. I thought he was maybe suffering from a mental illness, so I summoned his son and told him to look after his father, fearing that his self-harming behavior would interfere with the treatment. But I could tell his son was uninterested in what I had to say because he believed his father's story was true. I didn't think it was necessary to say anything else, so I went back to my business that day, thinking I'd find out later. Then his son came to tell me that he had returned to the village to check on his father's request. Sure enough, his son discovered the small mound that his father had built. Then he dug it up to double check and was very careful in doing so. His son saw the scattered bones as his father described them, and he did not lie. The son simply put the bones together out of curiosity, and it turned out that a piece of arm bone was indeed missing. What was more terrifying was that his son discovered in that grave the piece of his father's arm that had been rotting with maggots. Only then did his son fully believe his father wasn't lying, and that the unjust spirit had ripped off his father's hand.